I just want to show you how we're going to now use this grid. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some basics about drawing human anatomy and that kind of stuff. So you're going to have a hard time seeing my grid lines here because I drew them very faintly, which is exactly what we want. But you can see that I've labeled my row up here with letters and my numbers here on this row or this column corresponding to my image. So I'm all set to be ready to start drawing my subject here. You can start kind of wherever it makes sense to you in the picture. For me, I like to kind of draw as much of the silhouette as I can, just because then the features kind of start to make sense when I start to lay them in. So here's my lower section here. Looks like his throat and his Adam's apple begins at 8C. So I'm going to locate that down here on my drawing. And wherever that subject begins, kind of on that grid mark, I'm going to try and use that as a beginning point on my grid over here. And I can follow that line as well as possible to the next point on the grid. So this effectively gives us kind of a little guiding path. And when you're drawing this, it's something where you want to lightly, use your pencil lightly to kind of go back and forth, find that right line, and then move on. As you're trying to do that, you might realize that a line gets a little thick, so go back and you can erase over it so you can really focus on the line that you actually want there. And then I can see here on his this next one, his chin begins, and it kind of goes right through the corner there. So that's actually a really easy one to follow. You can see that I went ahead and I realized here that I was a little too, here let's let it focus. I was a little too far in, so I just went ahead and right away drew back out. As I noticed I was going into that next square, I saw that his eye here actually starts further out, so I just made that adjustment. Got to be willing to just go ahead and make those quick adjustments as you go. That's the beauty of having this grid, is it actually really speeds this process up and makes it quite accurate. So you can see there I'm starting to get hopefully what is a relatively similar silhouette here, down from his throat up to there, and then also seeing that on my drawing here. Now with a subject like this, and of course I think a lot of our subjects are going to have hair, you can choose to sort of continue following the silhouette up and go around the hair, or go up and follow the forehead down by the hairline. I kind of like to draw in the face, so I'll start by just kind of drawing in his approximate forehead and hairline there. I'll draw in his hair last once I don't have to deal with these grid lines, because hair is just a series of light value, dark value, light value, dark value, some in between. So to leave the grid lines in there is really just a hindrance. So I'll usually come back and do hair a little bit later after I've got everything else laid out. So once my silhouette's in, I can focus on the features. There's something to remember about each feature. The mouth, the nose, and the eyes all have some quirky little things we have to remember. So I'll start with the mouth. Now some of the subjects are going to have an open mouth, some have a closed mouth. Regardless of whether or not it's open or closed, the only actual line that we're going to draw is where the mouth is either open, where there are teeth, or where the lips are coming together. Remember we talked about actual and implied line? An actual line is a distinct mark, whereas implied line can be achieved by a series of marks, or in this case a value shift, say from light to dark. Our lips from the standpoint of, from a photographic standpoint, are really just a change in value. Notice here how we see just this highlight on his lower lip, and then it goes to a bit of a darker value, but there's no line there. The only line we can really discern is kind of around his teeth here. So what I'd like you to do is when you're drawing a mouth, draw that opening, whether it's open or actually just closed, where the lips come together. Draw that first. So for this, it's a little trickier because I've got an open mouth and I've got a lot more going on. But I'll just find you here, 6B. Might be easier actually to start over in 6C because there's a little less going on. So 6C, and I'm going to do my best just to capture right where his teeth almost come together. It's looking a bit weird right now, but that's okay. It's actually good. Next I'll draw in his teeth. Now, the funny thing about drawing teeth is if you draw those lines all the way through, generally it's going to look like he's got cartoon teeth or he hasn't brushed his teeth in about a year. So you want to really just draw kind of the beginning where the teeth start to come together, right down there at the edge of the teeth. Just draw a little line there. And then as we sort of finish this up, we'll go back and just put a very faint bit of value in there. But you don't want to draw a hard line in between each tooth because it's going to make him, it won't be very flattering. So now I know we're going to be very cautious about using actual line, but it's very helpful to use actual line as we're laying things out. So I'm just going to draw in some faint lines here, just so that I can have an idea of where things are going to end up once I erase these grid lines, because it's really important that you erase the grid lines before we actually start to shade, because shading is a very delicate sort of process, and if you're trying to go back in and erase lines out of a shaded area, you're just going to be doing that work twice. Okay, so I'm going to leave it looking weird there, just a floating mouth. Up to the nose. So the thing to remember about the nose is that it's a lot like the mouth, drawing the mouth, in that you've really only ever got one distinct actual line that you'll draw, and that's going to be in the nostrils, where that negative space all of a sudden turns very dark. We can draw an actual line here that defines that dark area from that light area, but otherwise, everything else is just value shift. From the bridge of the nose down here to the outside of the nostril, even underneath, right where the upper lip begins, it's really all just value shift. Maybe a little bit of an actual line there, but even there we have to be careful. It's really just a sort of a dark patch. So I like to start by drawing the nostril, finding where that's going to be. So on mine, it looks like it's going to be, is that 5B? Okay, so right here. Now this nostril is kind of just sitting in the middle of the square here, so that's going to be a little tricky. So I'm going to show you a little trick here. So for a 1.5 inch square, I've got to do 0.75 inches. Of course, if you're doing if you're on 1 inch squares, you're lucky. You're just doing half inches there. So then I've got to come over here and I've got to do the same on my grid. So this can be something that you might want to invest in if you are really struggling with how to place something. You can see now I've got a bit of a grid here on his nose, and then I've also got a corresponding grid here that's got some smaller squares in it too. So I can register it more easily for me. Okay. Wish there were a way just to not let it focus anymore. Oh, here we go. Maybe? Okay. So you can kind of see the grid there. You can see the grid here. Now I can see that the upper corner of that nostril kind of is hanging out just right up in that upper left box. So I'll get there. And then I can see that it kind of comes down and ends a little bit above that one. Important to remember that that actual line we're drawing is really only occurring at the top of the nostril though, because it's really going to quickly fade out into just a sort of a shadow. So we want to be really careful not to draw just a circle or an ellipse. Just draw sort of the top of that nostril where it seems or where it appears to be going. The next thing you want to do with the nose is generally to hit the outside there where the nostril connects to the face, and then also on the opposite side of the nose here, it's a pretty abrupt value shift. So I can be confident that drawing a little line there is not going to hurt me. Okay, so then we'll leave that there for now. We're going to come back and give it value so it won't look so weird. Next, I'm going to be moving on to the eyes. So generally there are kind of two views for the eye that we come across in this project. There's the frontal eye, which is just looking straight on at a figure, or the 3/4 view, which Mr. Frost has given us here, where the head is slightly tilted. So as he's turning toward us, we're seeing more of his left side of his face, less of his right side. So it does a couple of things. In this case, it sort of tilts my figure, right? So notice how his eyes are like that. Whereas, if you were looking right at me, hopefully, unless he were a flounder fish, his eyes would be sort of parallel to those horizontal lines. So it's really important at this point to remind you to draw what you see, not what you think you see. Because we make a lot of assumptions about eyeballs are round, mouths look like footballs, or whatever it is. But in this project, you really got to try to use these guidelines. View this not so much as an eye, but as a subject. So just to give a quick little demo on the human eye, generally speaking, and I'm just going to kind of freehand one from my head here. If I were looking straight on at an eyeball, I would see, first of all, I might notice the pupil, right? We know what that is. That's the dark part of the center of the eye. And then we've got the iris, which is a circle larger around the pupil. Now, the eyeball is what it sounds like. It's a ball. It's spherical. And it sits back in our eye socket, and we've got two lids that, of course, open and close. Now, the way that those eyelids rest is unique. We've got the lower eyelid that kind of tends to kind of cradle and be a little more like football shaped, like we imagine eyes look like. But then we have also in here on the inside where the nose would be, so if my nose is here, we've got a little tear duct. And that little tear duct joins the lower lid and the upper lid. And so the upper lid tends actually to be a little higher toward our nose, and then kind of swoop down a bit and be a little bit longer a little bit narrower on the outside. And that upper lid always kind of rests over that lower lid. And a lot of times you can sort of see the transition from the interest in value there from the tear duct into the eyeball. So 3 things to remember: tear duct, lower eyelid, and then the upper eyelid is a little more asymmetrical, and it tends to fall and kind of rest over the lower eyelid. And that's just a really basic kind of thing to know about how we might represent that part of the human anatomy. We know that now. I'm going to reference back here to my image. And for me, the best way to draw eyes is to just try and get the basic outline of kind of what I know what I'm working with. And here it makes sense to sort of start at the bridge of his nose. So I can tell that his upper part of his eye is going to be starting right about above halfway, the line between 4A and B. So I'm going to go over there, and I'm going to just start my drawing there. You can see it kind of swoops back toward the bridge of his nose. And then with these 3/4 views, the eye disappears really quickly. On the outside of the eye disappears really quickly. You get kind of just this really abrupt kind of shading back here. And then I can go in and drawing the iris and the pupil is really easy. So we can do that. And then I've got my other one over here for BC. And in this case, his eye is just hanging out right up here. And it's just barely hitting the top of that line in between 3 and 4C. One of the things you'll have to tinker with is making sure these eyes end up actually looking like they're looking in the right direction. And that's going to take a little bit of erasing and redrawing. But we look at people every day, so you'll know when it looks right and when it doesn't. You'll have to tinker with it. He's got a little more of a smirk over here too. So I'm going to give him. The mouth needs some work, so I'll pay more attention to it. But hopefully you'll have more time to do this than I am, or I do in this demo. So these should be really good. So anyway, you can see how I'm sort of starting to lay in my features here, and then once everything's laid out and we're really confident about how it looks, we can go back and start shading.